Sue,
Yes.
would you bless us, please?
I will try. I know God will, even
I
Sue
know.
doesn't.
You know to pray.
Gracious Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time of being able to gather together, study your word, bring different insights into this lesson as you have brought different things into our lives and how we have grown because of it. We just thank you for Bruce and the work that he does every week to prepare this lesson for us. And we just pray that we will each take a nugget home that we can chew on and think about this week. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. So, yeah, well, we're working on a little bit of a skeleton crew, but I imagine like Jack is probably on his way, and maybe
He's coming
one or two
back.
others. The elders usually straggling because they have their own responsibilities downstairs. But okay, so we finished up with the Samaritan woman last week, and are finishing up chapter 4 and digging into chapter 5. And when we read the scriptures, no matter what they are, Old or New Testament, they didn't have verses or chapters when they were written, right? And so it gets clunky sometimes. Whoever decided to do this, I appreciate the fact that they went all the trouble to do it, because it makes it easier for us to find things, and reference it. But it doesn't always work out real cleanly either. I think you'll understand where I'm coming from. Spend the whole entire chapter 4 dealing with this story of the Samaritan woman that tags on this little bitty story at the end. Because it's got to go somewhere after all, right? So they finish their 2 days in Sychar in Samaria because they were invited to stay, and so they did. Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. Okay, so let's stop right there just for a second. Let's walk back the sequence of events here, okay, that we've been through so far the past few chapters. It's actually a relatively short period of time that's being covered. And that's what John does. It's kind of interesting. He really chronologically, he skips big chunks of time and concentrates on these relatively small periods of time that are unique to his account of Jesus compared to the other synoptics of the other 3 Gospels. They cover like the whole 3.5 years, and he did this and did this and did this and did this and just crammed the whole gospel full of the parables and the activities and the miracles, right? Whereas John he kind of eschews the parables, right? He just says, yeah, and this was written after the synoptics. Says, well, everybody's got the parables, it seems like, right? Because he just ignores them. He brings in different moments of teaching that Jesus did that he watched, or that he was, privy to secondhand in the immediacy, and records them because he feels like they're of some value. And here we are 2,000 years later, talking about them, right? And we see the value in them, right? We really, really do see the value in them. So they have gone down to Jerusalem from Galilee for the Passover. And if we go back a couple chapters, while he was there, he cleanses the temple, makes a big hubbub and ruckus. He does a bunch of miracles, and it's almost in passing that John talks about this. He says that he is performing signs while he was in Jerusalem during Passover, and many were believing in him. You remember that? If you were here for that text, many were believing in him. So Passover ends. Then they decide to make their way back up to Galilee, because that's who they are. They're Galileans, that's where they're from, that's where he's been doing the majority of his ministry, even though the majority of the book of John is written in context of being in Jerusalem or in Judea. That's what's different from John to the other synoptics too, is that a lot of that time is spent in Galilee also. A lot of stuff didn't happen in Galilee in the synoptics. He actually doesn't spend that much time in Galilee, John doesn't. He spent a lot of time in Judea and a lot of time conversing with people. In fact, we're going to get into in the center-ish part of this gospel where it's just about basically one night, and it's chapters long. You know which night I'm talking about, don't you? So, he just wants to bring in stuff that people aren't privy to, that not only is helpful to the Christians of the first century, but also it is presenting positions that are really necessary to the fundamental tenets of Christianity, right, and the church, and what Jesus came here to do and who he was, right? To set up a defense through his gospel to false teachings about Jesus. Does that make sense? For instance, one of the big ones that grew out of the first century was that Jesus was not God, or that Jesus was not human also. And John takes quite the active exception to that, to both of those things. He's going around claiming to be deity. John calls him deity in the prologue himself. Not Jesus talking about himself, John talking about him. And writing a new creation story, right, at the very beginning. And all the things that Jesus infers during the entire gospel that gets him in big trouble. He's a troublemaker with the Jews. Okay, with the Jews, okay? And normally I have NIV up on the screen here, but we have an American Standard Version up here instead this morning for a reason. For a reason. It's because of that. Right? Oh, I'm sorry, that was your phone. Never mind.
Might as well have been me.
Me and Ray go back a while. A few minutes.
Don't hold it against him.
Anyway, so they come out of Judea. They're traveling up through where to go back home? Samaria. They spend a couple days there. It's a 3 to 4 day journey from Jerusalem up to where they're from in Galilee. Okay, so they choose, instead of going around and kind of skirting Samaria, which is what most Jews would do from Judea to Galilee and back and forth, because they considered Samaritans unclean, off limits, no bueno, etc. But that's not what Jesus did. So he spends time in Samaria, and it's springboarded at this conversation with the woman at the well. Now they're done. Now they're continuing their trip back to Galilee after the Passover. So it's actually just, we're talking about inside of 2 weeks period of time that's going on here. He reminds the guys that are traveling with him, he testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. You've heard that before, right? You're familiar with that statement that Jesus has made. He makes it here, he makes it elsewhere. That, and you can see it. You see it in the Gospels, in John's Gospel and the Synoptics, that when Jesus is in Galilee, they don't relate to him the same way as do the other people in the outlying areas. Is this not Joseph's son? Isn't this just Joseph's son, the carpenter? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? One of his own followers said that. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? His brothers didn't even believe in him. You don't see his brothers in the Gospels in an active role. The only time they show up in the texts of the Gospels is that they're either antagonizing him or still is not believing in him, and it's his mother that provides the family support, the family encouragement. And that's it. And obviously Joseph is out of the picture. most Jewish males were considerably older than their wives. And most Jewish males that were in the working class, especially, died fairly young. So it's not really surprising that Joseph isn't ever mentioned as being alive during the Gospels during Jesus is well into his adult life. Right? He's 30 when he starts his ministry, right? So by that time there's no mention of Joseph, his earthly father, at all. So there's one person in the family. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, one thought with the prophets too is he's certainly alluding back to all the prophets.
Yes.
In this tradition of
Yes.
prophets being hated, right?
That's exactly what he's referring to. Yes, yes, he is referencing and alluding to that. That's coming from Old Testament prophet statements also, right? Exactly. And that comes from him. I mean, if he's deity, then he's kind of responsible for those statements too, right? Also even in the Old Testament, right? So a prophet has no honor in his own country because they know him too well. I know that guy. He is not all that. I grew up with him. He's my older brother. I know, blah, 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 blah. That's how the world operates, right? We've never heard things like that before. Well, he gets it too. But what happened, though, interestingly, is that while he was gone this particular time, this is the first Passover that's recorded in the Gospel of John, where he went down during his ministry, and then came back and came home. Okay? And you can thank John for the fact that we know, scholars know that Jesus' ministry was about 3.5 years long, because of John's recordings of the Passovers. The Synoptics don't do that. He does. He brings the reader and the viewers into that reality that he was keeping these feasts, and not just the Passover, okay? Because we're going to get to tabernacles real soon, as well as Hanukkah. we never talk about, well, never. We hardly ever talk about that reality that it actually is mentioned in the Gospels, that Jesus celebrated with the disciples Hanukkah. Okay, he really did. And so and everybody's going, where was that? We'll get to that down the line. It just doesn't say Hanukkah. It's not translated into the word Hanukkah in our English translations. So we completely miss it and we spend no time thinking about it. It's just a feast.
And that would have been a relatively young holiday at that point.
Yes,
150
exactly.
years.
Yeah, it is celebrating what?
Maccabees.
The Maccabean revolts, right? Yeah. Yep. And so, he, as well as other Jews, that was a thing that they celebrated at that time. Why wouldn't he? He's Jewish. So, but John pays a lot of attention to the Passovers especially. So, what's he doing at the Passover again while he's down there in Jerusalem? Performing many signs. And a lot of people are believing in him. And then they're dispersing because there's tons and tons and tons and tons of people in Jerusalem that don't live in Jerusalem. Now they're all going back home. Right? So he mentions, well, John says, this is John writing, after the 2 days he went from there into Galilee. For Jesus himself testified, it's kind of like in past tense, just a past tense statement that he has said this. Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him. Galileans received him, having seen all the things that he did in Jerusalem at the feast, for they themselves also went to the feast. And they couldn't avoid him, pretty much. It's like, come on, Martha, let's go home. There was a Martha in the Bible, but not this one. Let's go home, if they're in Galilee. Oh, we're not going to, and then he's performing actual real deal signs. that a lot of them are seeing. Because let's face it, if you could go to Passover in Jerusalem, you went to Passover in Jerusalem. So it's just glutted with, a couple million people probably, basically, or so, right? Now their attitude has changed a little bit, but remember something, what has happened in sequence, right? He's in Jerusalem for the Passover, and he gets visited by somebody. Who was that somebody that came to him to see him in the middle of the night? Nicodemus in Jerusalem during the Passover, and has this conversation we see in the 3rd chapter that we went through. And he's teaching. He's having a conversation where he's actually teaching stuff. He's not doing any miracles for Nicodemus, not doing anything personal for Nicodemus. He is teaching Nicodemus, because Nicodemus comes to him to start asking him questions because he's curious. So you have that type of personality, right? He's a Jewish man, and he's actually a Jewish leader. He's actually in the Sanhedrin, and he's a Pharisee. Okay? Then we exit Jerusalem, come up into Samaria, and we encounter this woman who's a Samaritan, who's got a quote-unquote past that there's probably a lot of pain and grief involved in and everything like that. And she's got enough cred with her town folk to get them all to come out and see this guy. Could this be possibly the Messiah? It's the first time we hear the term Messiah talked about in the Gospel of John. In Samaria.
It's hard to overstate that, how big of a deal that is.
It's a huge thing. It really is. It is hard to overstate that. I think it's an atomic bomb theologically in the sequencing and in the strategies that Jesus uses. How he chooses to bring the good news into the world, right? So he talks to her. He uses her, a little relationship with her that causes them to stay there for a couple days at their invitation to teach them more, and they're all believing in him personally. No mention of any signs. None. No mention of any signs done in Samaria at all. Signs in Jerusalem, no signs in Samaria. People believing in him, people are actually really believing in him for who he is, not for what he did, but for who he is and what he's telling them, and that he reveals things that he really shouldn't know. But he's not doing any signs, right? Unless you call knowing her life a sign, her personally, directly, right? Unless you do that. It would be a sign to me, I would think. But we see that the term signs, this is why I like to bring this up, because is it a sign or not? It's kind of like a game show. Sign or no sign? Because a lot of scholars don't refer to a lot of these things as signs. There's supposedly seven signs, right? 7 signs that scholars like to love, but there's no numbering them. It's not like they're numbered. Here's number 1, here's number 2, and here's number, and you got all these other surrounding things that apparently don't qualify as signs, okay? Including the resurrection of Jesus, when he just called it a sign before it was going to happen. It's not recognized as on the list of 7 signs in the Gospel of John, even though Jesus calls it a sign, and it's something that he does.
I think to those who believed it obviously it was a sign, and
Of course it is.
he told me everything
Of
about my
course.
life, and
Yeah.
it was a short conversation, a reasonably short conversation, but yet he told me everything I ever did.
Yeah.
And she's basically pointing out, I mean, in human communication, it's not possible to tell somebody everything in one
No,
day, but she's
no.
basically pointing out
A lot of
all the
stuff.
important
Yep.
factors of her faith.
Mhm.
But I go back to, it's here, and I started to say it earlier, and I was just gonna say the one line, ears to hear.
Yes.
They didn't
Yes.
have the ears to hear, they
Mhm.
didn't have that same thing, though, and Jesus was saying,
Thank you.
you know, pointing out what happened in the tabernacle, going back to that, he said, you don't understand, and I come as wind, you know, basically, and
Yeah, very
those
good.
who want to hear it or want to feel it are going to get it, and those who don't, and I think that's the key here, but yeah, it's a sign to those who believe. How would it not be? It is to us today, it's a
It caught her attention and he knew it would. Interesting enough, right?
Because it was assigned to her.
To her.
But it was she that had to go to the people.
She became the witness, right? She became the witness.
Because many times we heard, if you want to believe that, you can believe
That's
it from
right.
our friends that were
That's
not
right.
ready yet.
That's right. So as we get into this next chapter, not this specific thing, but the next chapter, chapter 5 here, is going to be all court of law language.
From
It's just-
chapter
it's-
1, sorry,
Go ahead.
from chapter 1 on, I believe through the whole book,
Mhm.
it's sign after sign after sign after sign.
It is some kind, I mean, it's just funny, it just became humorous to me, ironic to me when I started digging around in the book and digging into the scholarship and all the things, commentary, stuff like that, you know, people had cleverly listed out 7 signs in the Gospel of John, because, quite honestly, if I can be just blunt, we like the number 7. And we do, and there's a reason why we do, right? Let's not ignore it. There's a reason why we like the number 7, because it appears in Scripture for a reason. And there's that completeness number, right? But let's make good positions and good arguments, right? I mean, it's replete with signs. You haven't to define signs. Right? Also, you're having to define what qualifies as a sign. But it's just, again, ironic and humorous to me that you end up having literally Jesus saying, this is a sign to you. And that sign's not on the list. So anyway, so they came in to Galilee, to Cana of Galilee. So we have started in the 2nd chapter with his first miracle. It literally says, this is the first sign he did. It does say that. But it doesn't continue to number his miracles, or his signs, either. It doesn't do that. But it does say it's his first. And now we're going to see his second, but I want to note something in it here as we go through this text. Something that we need to consider about it. He came to Cana, the place where it all began, the signs began, where he made the water wine. Reminds the reader. And there was a royal official whose son was sick at Capernaum. Capernaum is down on the lake. Cana is not. He's a little distance away, right? Both in Galilee. Royal official. Somebody talk about the royal official. What would be a royal official? Who are they talking about? Who's the royalty that he is an official of?
Well, there's Herod's royalty, and then there's the Roman.
Kind of, sort of,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you had Pilate, right? Was Pilate royalty? He was the governor, right? The Roman governor, right? Yeah. But we do know that the Jews had a royal entity, right? And you already mentioned him, right? He was considered king, Herod.
Yep.
This is Herod Antipas, not Herod the Great. Herod the Great was in that position when Jesus was born. This is his son, Herod Antipas. By this point, royalty line, right? right? By the way, the emperor wasn't the only one in their world that was referred to as God or the Son of God. Herod Antipas was too. So a lot of what we see Jesus saying about himself, and the writer is saying about Jesus, are direct instigations or direct confrontations with the culture at large on different levels. It could be Roman, it could be Greco, Hellenistic Greco-Roman, it could be Jewish, and things that he says about who he is. And standing up who he is against the culture, the world, even the religious world that he was in the middle of. Herod really was not respected among the Jews population-wise. He just got into it because of the corruption and politics of his father. They're not pure blood. Kind of like Samaritans in that sense. And his palace was not in Judea or Galilee. It was in Perea, which is over on the other side of the Jordan River. But he had his own palace, his own court, his own servants. Here's a guy who apparently either served him outside of Perea or was visiting Galilee for some reason, right? A royal official. Okay. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, kind of maybe implying that maybe he was in Jerusalem during the Passover, possibly.
He was what?
In Jerusalem during the Passover, when Jesus was performing signs, because he was healing people. John didn't record exactly what the signs were, but it's easy to, because the texts assume that there was some healing going on in Jerusalem. This is one of the assumptions you can make from this text, because he says, oh, Jesus is around, my son's sick. I have the answer. I've got the answer. Jesus, let's go find Jesus, right? So that strongly implies that Jesus was doing healing in Judea. And you heard they come from Judea up there. He's available. Jesus is available. Maybe he can heal my sick son. When he heard that, he went to him and was imploring him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. They're in Cana. The son is in Capernaum. They can travel from Cana to Capernaum without too much trouble and go and heal his son. Now remember all the sequences of how people are operating, and he's operating with other people so far, and the things that have been stated about why people in the world are operating and acting, and he is acting in relationship to them. Look at this. So Jesus said to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. Thanks, Jesus. He believes that Jesus is capable of healing his son. Or he wouldn't be asking him, right? He believes that, okay? Why is Jesus saying this now that they've gotten back into Jew land, right? And so don't need to sound obnoxious or disrespectful about that. We're no longer in Samaria, where they didn't see any signs as a population. He's in Jerusalem before that, performing signs. Signs, no signs, Galilee. There's a sign that's being asked for. Literally somebody's asking him for it in Galilee, okay? And he's speaking a truth here, an unfortunate truth, okay? Unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. Is that a jump? in the conversation, is that kind of a weird jump? Jesus is taking advantage of the question, the request, and then just suddenly saying, man, you guys, if I don't perform for you, you just won't believe. I didn't perform for the Samaritans. I didn't perform for the Samaritans, but I got to perform for the Jewish population, right? The royal official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." See, I mean, he's just begging this guy. He's begging Jesus. This guy, Jesus. He's begging him, "Come down." And Jesus says to him, "Go, your son lives." He doesn't go with him. The request is that he go with him and heal his son, right? He doesn't go with him. Doesn't even go with him. He makes a statement about belief and signs and the value of signs, and he doesn't go with him. So he just says, "You go. Your son lives."
He spoke the word.
Yeah, that's all he had to do. Which is a bigger sign,
Yes, it is.
right? It's a bigger sign than just going with him and, praying and commanding and all this kind of stuff. You guys are gonna have to figure out something about me.
I'm not
I'm
gonna
not a
be here forever.
performer. I'm not a circus act. I'm not a vending machine. I'm the Son of God, and I'm the Messiah. And yes, I do have power, but it's going to be under my terms. It's going to be under my will.
But I think he's also pointing ahead that there will be a time that he is not here.
That's very true, Sue. That's very true.
But-
very good. Yeah.
My power
Mhm.
will live in you
Still
and
exists.
be able to do things.
Yeah, still exists. Yeah.
But his will was, as he said earlier and after, the will of his Father.
Mm.
And whatever his
Yes.
Father asked of him, or
Yes.
whatever he asked of his Father, is this what you want me
Yes.
to do?
Because what Stephen's talking about right now is something they're going to get into again a couple times in the next chapter, where Jesus literally says the same thing. In the 4th chapter before, we already read in Samaria, he said to the disciples, "My food is what?
The will of God.
To do the will of God and the works of God and finish them." Verse 34, chapter 4. That's my food. That's an important statement that he has given his disciples and the rest of the world and us too. Right? That was actually what he lives for. That's what he is alive in the human body for, is to do his Father's will and to finish it. Right? And that's going to drench through this whole next section of text too. His will, he knew that guy was coming. He knew this guy was coming. And he had something to say to him and for those that were listening also. There's probably more people listening to him when he said, "Unless you can see signs, you just won't believe." Okay, here's a sign. Here you go. Have a nice day. So he gets down, he starts off, he believed the word. Notice that? He believed the word. That's an interesting observation that John gives us. This royal official believed the word. He said, Jesus' word was, "Go, your son lives." And he left and he went. He didn't grab, no, you gotta go, you gotta come with me. It's like, he went, he believed, he was, did he have any choice to believe him? I mean, we all got choices, right?
Yes.
We've got choices. But it seems like this guy was faced with a choice that he felt was irresistible, right? if this guy is capable of healing people, which is what the news is, and he's telling me, go, your son lives, I'm going to believe him. I'm going to believe him. I'm going to go. I'm going to believe him.
Without seeing.
That was his
Without
choice.
seeing.
Without seeing.
Yes,
That was his choice.
yes,
And the choice was to believe
Believe.
his word.
yeah,
And then,
yeah.
believing his word.
First, before the sign is seen.
Yeah.
Exactly. See how valuable this action is that's going on between Jesus and him? That we can see that applies to reality, right? Faith, belief, trust. Okay? It isn't created necessarily by seeing somebody do something cool. And that forces me into a little sidebar over here, that it seems like the Western church sometimes gets itself in trouble with doing all kinds of different strata and levels of doing cool stuff to get people's attention, to get them to sell Jesus to them. I'm just gonna leave it there. You can decide what all that would fill that, will you?
So, when stuff starts popping up in more than one class, I'm gonna have to say something. I wasn't gonna say anything.
Oh,
I know,
This is good though.
Well, you know,
See, he and I talk about this a lot.
you
This
gotta
happens.
ask yourself, then, if people want signs, and God gave signs to Pharaoh,
Yep.
God gave signs to the Israelites,
Mhm.
God gave signs here, and people want signs. Ask yourself, what is this sign for us today? Because Jesus died 2,000 years ago, and this is the conclusion I came up with, us.
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 We're the sign that,
That's right.
that I was dead,
Mhm.
I did terrible stuff, God changed me, and people saw that I was changed. So the sign, how important and how impactful is that for us as believers, that we're actually what God is talking about in the flesh walking now?
That's right.
And that's what we
That's
talked
what
about
we're-
on Wednesday?
Yep. It's really more about what the thread is in this whole entire gospel, is not about signs. That's why it kind of worries me a little bit that some scholars think that they have to number signs in the Gospel of John. When the thread is actually not about signs. The thread is about who Jesus is
Exactly.
and who we're believing Jesus is, and what he came to actually accomplish, that was the work of God, his Father, and finish it. That's the main thread of what he's doing from beginning to end of this whole entire gospel. It's not signs.
I would say for me, signs are miracles.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has helped me this last year is our women's Bible study. Our leader gave us a little book, just to start recording miracles. And you know, I think we always look for, big ones if someone's healed of cancer.
Right.
But it has taught me to look for Jesus and what he is doing in everyday life.
Yes.
And some of them people may say is the smallest miracle of all. But when you see it in a different way, because you're looking for it.
Thank you for springboarding us into chapters 5.
Okay.
Because this is exactly one of the
And
things
here,
we've been
Jack will
talking
take you
about.
to 6.
Jack?
No, I'm gonna go head down a rabbit trail.
Uh-oh. Okay, you got 1 minute.
This royal official reminds me of President Reagan. Trust but verify.
Okay.
He trusts what Jesus has told him, that his son will be alive, but he immediately heads out of town, heads back home, or wherever his son is, to verify. And he gets verification in this case,
Mhm.
because of the timing of the hour, the timing of
Exactly.
when
Yeah.
Jesus told him what was gonna happen and the time when it actually happened.
I like it.
In the rabbit trail.
Go ahead. No, that was a short rabbit trail. Thank you. That was
I knew
good.
Reagan was in John.
You gotta look closely there.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'll forget what I'm talking about. I was thinking that sometimes, you were talking previously about this being legal based, like.
Not yet.
Evidence
Go ahead.
based.
Yeah.
But some of what the signs are is evidence.
Correct.
It's
That's correct.
proofs and evidence
Mhm.
of who he really is. And so some people, just he himself is the evidence enough. And then
Yes.
some people have to see like some
Yes.
magic type things
Yes.
to, because their faith is not strong, or they're skeptical, or it's shallow, or something. Something,
Yes.
they have a different, a different perspective of what
What
a
this thing
Messiah is
really
gonna be.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very good. I don't know about you, but this morning Chris really got me thinking, and I've been thinking this for quite a while now, but I've been so hung up on John for the past few years. I said maybe the next book I'm going to be diving into is Job. Because did you love that sermon this morning?
Yes.
That was so good.
Very good.
And man, there's so much you could do about it. And he got no signs from God. In fact, everything was converse when this all came down. Right? This guy gets 4 words out of Jesus. Go, number 1. He has an instruction. He didn't say go, stop worrying and just go about your business. He said go. He's telling him to go home, right? He's going to see, go see your son. Your son lives. He didn't expect him to live when he came to see Jesus, right? He was dying. Go, your son lives. So 2 things. 1, go. So he's giving him a directive to do something. Then 2 is, your son lives. You're welcome. He didn't say that. I'm throwing that in. And so the guy doesn't argue. He doesn't debate. He doesn't persuade. He goes. See, the going itself is an act of faith, is an act of belief, right?
Commission.
So he believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he started off. That's what Jesus is looking for. That's what Jesus is looking for, people that don't require the sign. They require Jesus. We require him, not the sign. Job didn't require the sign, right? He required God. He wanted God, and he knew he still lived. Man.
There was 2 acts of action. One, he had to believe.
Yeah.
And then he went home.
He went, yes. He had to believe and go. So he's going down. His slaves met him, saying his son was living. So he inquired of them the hour that he began to get better. And they told him, yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him. So the father knew that it was at that hour in which Jesus said to him, your son lives. That's powerful, right? And it's personal at the same time.
Well, the other thing that I see here is that when the father heard that it was at the hour that Jesus had told him his son would live, it cemented his faith in his heart.
Yes.
It was reinforcement of his faith.
Exactly. So much so, right, that what do you get next? And he himself believed again, but did he believe more? Yeah, probably, I think, right? His belief in Jesus just suddenly went to another level. That yes, 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 yes. And look what happens. He himself believed, and his whole household. And his whole household didn't talk to Jesus or hear him talk.
But you got to tell somebody.
but he had a witness. The witness of Jesus personally goes and brings it to the household, and the
That
household
brings me to that
believes.
statement, I just.
Dude.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, yeah, this is great. So what? Look at this. This again is a second sign. Okay, he doesn't stop there. This again is the second sign that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. So he's giving context and reference to it being, in relation to a first sign, which also was in Cana. Maybe he's referencing, right, in Galilee. When he had come out of Judea, which is coming from Passover, right? He'd done a bunch of signs in Judea during Passover. It doesn't say he did any signs in Galilee. It says like the second sign that's mentioned that he does in Galilee. And actually, coincidentally, in the same town. Because Galilee, remember, in the previous statement, the prophet has no honor in his home, in his hometown, in his own country. So signs weren't going to really impress his family, his brothers and sisters, his town, his neighborhood, his neighboring towns that knew him. They knew him. They knew him for 30 years, outside of this context. Really? So now you're what? You're quitting your job? You're just going to quit your job, and you're going to go and do this. Now you're a rabbi. Okay, see ya. They just, they weren't buying into it. There was some other Galileans that he didn't know that he called to follow him. That said, okay, hey, I'm not educated, and I got an opportunity to follow a rabbi. Sure, I'll do that.
Well, Jesus deigned to show him a sign, give him a sign, and us.
Yeah.
But at the same time, people that didn't see signs believed, and people that saw signs didn't necessarily believe.
Didn't necessarily believe. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So, he's adapting to our weakness, or not
Thank
adapting,
you.
but
Yes.
he's helping us pick us up. But even when he does that, if your heart is hardened, then it's not going to really matter.
Yes. You are going to, we're a ways away from it, but let's just go ahead and just bring it up right now, because I think it's one of the biggest used just moments in the Gospel of John, and that's the raising of Lazarus. And when the Chosen series did that, there was a couple of things that I was looking for, that I wanted to see how they were going to interpret that whole incident, and how Jesus did it, and how he reacted to the sisters, and how the disciples were interpreting this and feeling this, and how I wanted to see Jesus cry. When it just says 2 words in one verse, Jesus wept, and we think that we're biblically smart, you know that this culture knew what it meant to cry. They didn't have a problem letting their emotions completely vacate their body when they were in grief. And I thought it was great. I mean, if you've seen that episode, you know what I'm talking about. They did justice. The only time I've ever seen any production do justice to Jesus crying. But the other thing that was noteworthy was that there was other people witnessing this outside of the circle. Like Mark is saying. They're witnessing the resurrection of the dead and going away to report it for malicious purposes. They witnessed it. They witnessed Lazarus rising from the dead right in front of them. They witnessed the grief. They knew that he was dead for 4 days. And yet they go away not believing. In fact, we're going to report this to the head honcho and tell him, we got problems, boss. You're right. Mark is right. He's appealing to specific people because what he's creating, as we talked about before, what he's creating is a base, a group, a population of witnesses that are going to build his church when he leaves. Witnesses. And we know that those that were on the inside, Lazarus' family, the disciples that were there, including the women disciples, that saw it. And they didn't know it was coming. It's a bigger story than we consider it even. It's a big story, but I think it's even bigger. When we get to it, we're going to see some things about the disciples that I've thought about and discovered after doing all this stuff. This again is the second sign that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea. So, let's go on to... Great, there it is. I blow up this font and everything gets goofy here. This is where things start to get really actually big from a teaching standpoint and from a position standpoint in the gospel. You think that we've talked about things that Jesus has been doing and what John's been recording that are big and cool, okay? This is when Jesus gets in the face of the Jews. The Greek calls them the Jews, okay? So let's stop and talk about that just for a minute, because we're going to go into next week in this text. When we talk about an entire population of people and describe them somehow, right, which we're prone to do, correct? That's what we do. You know, hey, I'm an American. Okay. Okay, thank you. I mean, it tells me where you're from. But I'll tell you what, America is composed of millions and millions of people that are all individuals and all might have completely different personalities and do, and ideologies and classes and ethnicities and ages and genders and all this kind of stuff. So when you say you're an American, that doesn't account for a lot of stuff, correct? So when he says the Jews, the NIV says the Jewish leaders, right? It translated, but technically, the bare bones language in the Greek is just the Jews, okay? Now remember, everybody is Jews. John is a Jew. Jesus is a Jew. The disciples are all Jews. The leaders are all Jews. Everybody around is Jews. But he is identifying this group that Jesus is talking to, even though he's Jewish, as the Jews. So he's obviously using language to construct, there's a group within the group that have a lot of power, right? Have power, they have influence, they know Scripture really well, really, really well. And they're the ones that run the show. They're the ones that run the show. Even though we already know that there is some individuals within that group that run the show, just like I'm talking about a minute ago, that aren't necessarily exactly like the power structure and the dynamic and the driving of the culture. Nicodemus is already showing himself. He's going to show up 3 more times in the gospel by name. We just think of him in the 3rd chapter. He shows up 4 times by name in the gospel. more than the disciples by name. And he's in the Sanhedrin. Joseph of Arimathea in the Sanhedrin. The two guys that were gutsy enough to go and get Jesus' body and put him in a tomb. So when he's talking about the Jews, he isn't just talking about simply a bunch of individuals. It's not that simple. What it is he's talking about an ideology also, and a power structure, and a cultural system that drives everything. That the Jews are under the control of. There's a population under the control of that he's going to start dealing with in this chapter. After these things, there was a feast. It doesn't identify which feast of the Jews it is, but Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Probably Tabernacles. There are some things revealed in these texts as we follow. There's probably the Tabernacles feast. Now there was in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda or Bethsaida. I'm going to read a little bit before I go on out of the IVP commentary, which is, yeah, that's a serious commentary. That I thought was of interest as we go forward into this story. Yep, there we are. So, healing shrines were common throughout the ancient world, especially for the worship of Asclepius, which is a Greek god. Another popular deity is renowned for healing powers. And what we easily forget is that Hellenism, the Greek culture, actually lives in the Jewish provinces. It's just not prevalent, but it actually exists the way that they operate in some factions. And just because you're a Jew didn't mean that you believed in all the things that the Pharisees believed. The Sadducees are a good example. And they had power also. They weren't very much like the Pharisees. So, most of these shrines required the supplicants to purify themselves at an adjoining fountain or other source of water. This passage portrays Jesus as greater than such healing sanctuaries. More critically, this chapter reveals Jesus as the Father's agent. We're going to get into that as we go along. Hence, able to perform divine acts even on the Sabbath. Contrasting characters was a common rhetorical and literary device in antiquity, probably applied by John here. John does not specify which Jewish feast is the occasion, although manuscripts have the feast, which would probably imply the Feast of Tabernacles, just calling it the feast. There weren't necessarily all the feasts you would be going up to Jerusalem to do. Tabernacles is one. But it's not Passover. But the real issue for this narrative is that the day on which Jesus heals is a Sabbath. That's the critical thing, not that it's the feast. Bless you.
It'll go on forever.
Public baths were standard in Greco-Roman cities and people congregated there. The Qumran scroll attests to the name of this pool. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually has the name of this pool recorded in one of them. And archaeologists have discovered a pool in this location fitting precisely this description, even though there are things that are built in and around and over what it was at one time. there's a monastery in Jerusalem that basically built over it. But the pools were quite large, and in brackets it says like a football field. Big. And roughly 20 feet deep. So you could swim and dive under the water, right? The site had two twin pools surrounded by 4 porches or porticos, and one porch, a 5th one, down the middle, separating the pools, perhaps separating genders. Although John writes after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, remember this, when he's talking about this, he's recording something that happened decades before, and the city and the temple are now destroyed. But he's letting people know in the 1st century who may or may not know much about Jerusalem, this is a place that used to exist also. His recollection of the site is accurate. The man had been sick there longer than many people in antiquity lived. He's 38 years old, it says in the text. And he was alive longer with his paralysis than most guys lived. For about as many years as Israel had wandered in the wilderness. Ancient reports of healings often specified how long the person had been sick to emphasize the greatness of the healer's cure. Obviously nothing else, including this pool, had succeeded in restoring him. He was still lame, okay? So with that, we are going to close this morning, and we'll get into this story next week. Let's all stand. Thank you guys very much for the comments and questions and good stuff, as usual. Father, thanks, Lord, for giving us this time. Thanks for your word. Thanks for John sitting and recording this material for us that we are studying 2,000 years later, and the pivotal things that are happening in there that speak into our faith in the present tense, Lord. It's such an amazing thing to see how you work and what you're capable of doing in our own personal lives as well, Lord, after all these centuries. Go with us and bless us with your Spirit and empower us to be the people that you want us to be and build our faith, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.